Hello and welcome to the DEI's podcast. This is your host and community engagement lead to DiVerity's Consultant Network, Enrico Imanalo, coming to you live from the Bay Area. The DEI's podcast is written and created by DEI practitioners for DEI practitioners and the organizations that look for them. If you need help with your people and culture problems, come check us out at DiVerity.com to see if we're the community you're looking for. So, thank you all for joining us today. On June 29th and June 30th, 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS, made a trio of rulings on affirmative action, student loans, and religion, free speech, and gay rights, which meant that moving forward, race could not be used as a factor in admissions, student loan debt will not be forgiven, and that despite a state law prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation, well, people, it's this case, Elena's Creative 30 versus Creative 303, right? So they are not allowed to, or rather free speech will take precedence over the rights of LGBTQI plus people. Sorry about that. So what does this all mean for DEI and social justice? In higher ed and the workplace moving forward, or excuse me, actually today, early childhood education and 12th grade education. With me today to talk about that very thing are Dr. Katherine Giscombe, founder of Giscombe and Associates, who also led the groundbreaking study on women of color in corporate management, Diane Bell-McKoy, president of Opportunity Connection LLC, Dr. Marshaun Hymon, co-founder and managing partner of True Change Alliance LLC, and Karima Wilson, founder of Forged Ed. And it appears I need to do more editing in my script before I go live with it, but here we are today anyway. If we could pivot to everybody, thank you very much for joining us today. I think I'll start with you, Dr. Giscombe. If you could just let us know very quickly about your connection to the topic that we're discussing today, that would be great.
Yeah, in addition to having done a lot of research on women of color, I'm very interested in what happens with girls of color. And I've also had a lot of really good opportunities in working with independent schools, which are more liberal than, say, the typical public K through 12 education. And I just have some thoughts about what public schools can learn from these independent schools in terms of just having greater emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Great. And I think before the show, you also mentioned that you recently had a client where you're doing some research or some work with K to 12 education,
Right.
correct?
Uh-huh. Yep.
Great, great. Diane, let's pivot to you.
Thanks. And so the interest for me is very much probably most of my career in terms of focusing on being in government and focusing in the nonprofit world and understanding that clearly the kind of social economic impact in terms of not paying attention to this, what happens in terms of early childhood through 12th grade, in terms of not addressing those elements of systemic racism, in terms of making a difference, having been on the school board locally, obviously in terms of part of that, but obviously having been in government and education being a big part of that. And I would say even more recently, really understanding that if we're talking about the long term in terms of all those systems in this country, that is a continuum from early childhood and lots of work with early childhood funders around paying attention to this for the outcome and the future economically for us as a country.
And so, of course, I took the time to look at your resume or your work experience as listed on LinkedIn. And I think if people were to look you up, Diane, they'd be very impressed by the titles you've held and the organizations that you've been a part of. So I wonder if you just might briefly mention some of those experiences so people have kind of that greater context.
Well, I'll begin with a name that many people obviously know across the country in terms of I started off in Marion Barry's administration in Washington, D.C. in
Oh,
terms, and so that my feet were grounded in that belief about the value and the importance of Black people and the economics of that. And so moving forward in terms of Kurt Schmoke's administration and being a part of Kurt Schmoke as the first Black mayor in Baltimore, being a part of lots of energy moving that agenda forward, including the Empowerment Zone, working with Jim Rouse. I ran the Empowerment Zone, and I'm proud to say the best in the country because we tracked our economic outcomes in terms of those investments, and it was community very much driven forward to moving all the way up to where I last worked for my own business started in terms of Associated Black Charities, but was on probably 4 to 10 different boards throughout that, including school board, Greater Baltimore Committee. It's always been very entrenched in community and making sure community were part of informing me in any space I've ever been in, because I understand this is about community, and particularly for me, for Black people, in terms of what their lives are like, so that I'm always going to know what that want to know what that means. And I think that's where I cut my teeth to understand around the systemic challenges that continue to keep us, that you've got enough money, you can make changes, but you don't change the systems.
So this topic is more than a passing interest for you, shall we say?
It's a passion.
Dr. Hymon, let's pivot to you.
Of course. Hey, everybody. My name is Dr. Marshaun R. I am really excited about this topic and interested because I began my career as a public school music educator. And as an educator generally, this is a passion of mine. But specifically, I know that music and an instrument talent has been an affirmative way to provide opportunity to students in entering college. So I am extremely interested in this. And I've moved forward in my career and now serve as a diversity consultant, working in organizations to help them change their hiring practices and change their organizational practices. So those two coming together makes me extremely excited to talk to you all today.
Thank you so much. Karima?
Yes, I'm excited to be here as well. So thanks for having me. And my background is from first as a teacher as well. I started off as a public school teacher here in Houston, Texas, and then became a principal. And since then, I now work as a consultant with different schools. I'm at a school here today and all around the country. And we really work to help schools, educators build ecosystems where students of color can thrive. And so that's a little bit of my background.
Thank you so much. And I love that you use that phrasing, or that framing rather, of ecosystems, right? So, people might not really understand the direct connection between the SCOTUS rulings and early childhood through 12th grade education. But if we take that systems, or more aptly that ecosystem view, then we can start to see the interrelations of things, right? So we probably remember from school that graphic of the water cycle or the food chain or something like that. But, more than just those systems are interconnected with everything else. And so what we're trying to do today is shine some light on what some of those impacts may be, even if they may be somewhat indirect. So before we jump into that, I am going to pivot to our audience, right, to just get some engagement going here. What's one thing you want the K-12, and sorry, Diane, I know it should be early childhood through 12th grade education, but there's a character limit, population to know about current DEI and social justice efforts as they eventually enter higher education and the workforce? So if you've got thoughts on that, please let us know in the comments. But for now, we are going to pivot into our questions. So what do the recent SCOTUS rulings mean for early childhood to 12th grade education? As in part one of this discussion, let's start by clearly articulating what affirmative action is and what it isn't. And Dr. Hymon, if you could start us off, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's never been a extremely really clean definition, so I invite everyone else to jump in as well. But affirmative action is the acknowledgement that inequality in our society, and that has caused some groups to be excluded from opportunity, specifically women and people of color. So affirmative action is a positive correction to ensure that all people have access to quality education and employment. What's really interesting is that the Supreme Court decision was not based on the idea that systemic issues exist in our country, but it was that the idea that all students benefit from a diverse classroom actually lacks evidence. At least that's what the Supreme Court said. So it's really interesting to kind of follow through on that. There is data and evidence that shows that diversity does matter, but it has not made its way to our Supreme Court justices. So I'll pause there. I'd love to invite anybody else to add on or clarify.
Yeah, I think one thing that we definitely want to emphasize for people is that the Supreme Court ruling is specifically for higher education. It does not mean that there is no affirmative action or equal employment, policies in place for the workplace, right? So people are seeing that ruling and saying, oh, no more DEI, which is just not the case, right? That's really jumping the shark here. So let's move back to that first part of the question. Like, in general, what do we all think that the recent SCOTUS rulings mean for early childhood to 12th grade education? Anybody can start here.
Well, I just wanted to jump in as well and say affirmative action isn't and hasn't ever been any sort of attempt or aligned with a vision of reparations, right? And so I think oftentimes there can be this idea that they're one and the same, or that affirmative actions is a direct way to repair, specifically for Black Americans, but potentially for other groups as well, past policies and the impact of those policies. And there's always in the world of the Supreme Court sort of what matters is the way you're able to make the argument and then what the law says, right? So the way that affirmative action policies were brought about was to say that large, universities would benefit from diversity, and so therefore could use race to help to determine who's part of any incoming class. And so now they're saying the way you've been using race isn't quite right. So stop using it in this way. So stop using it directly. But if a person wants to say, hey, I've experienced discrimination because of my racial background, then it seems to say that schools can still use it in that way. And I think that's where we're not sure yet what's going to happen at the K-12, right?
Yeah. So Karima, if I can follow up here, because I do want to unpack for the audience something that you said just now, which was affirmative action is not a form of reparations, right? So to those of us in the room, we have a firm grasp of what that means. But for somebody else who's like, maybe that didn't even cross their mind, I wonder if you could just shine a little bit more light on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you understand the history of our country, then you understand that we have had large and historical, for many years, harm done to different groups, specifically based on their race, right? So as a Black American, what that looked like for my ancestors would have been chattel slavery at one point. And then after that, it would have meant, Jim Crow policies, whether they differed from state to state, but the inability to buy houses in certain communities, the inability to attend certain schools, et cetera, et cetera. So at some point, the US government could decide to make a policy that says we want to amend the harm we did, or we want to pay financially or in some way make change to say we acknowledge the harm that was done for this number of years in the past by doing X, Y, or Z. And there are examples of where the US government has paid reparations. I think that there were reparations given for Japanese Americans who lived and so there's no policy basis or no basis in our country for that. But we have yet to sort of have a political will to do it, in particular for Black Americans. And so affirmative action, while many people see it often as sort of symbolically repairing harm, it is not specifically intended to repair the harm.
Right. So just to drill down on that, right? So equal employment opportunity policy and things like that, that's dealing with the fact of diversity as it exists rather than the history of it or, anything in the past that it just addresses right now, basically. So let's see. In your view, and this is to everybody, what do the recent SCOTUS rulings mean for the future of the workplace, particularly if we're expanding the view to include early childhood to 12th grade education?
Well, I think it means that the workplace will not be as diverse. If, for example, there's this chilling effect that seems to have already happened, that it should not, like different institutions should not take into account the racial background, the racial makeup of their organizations. But I think more specifically about schools, and I think this also does relate to the workforce, it seems that this ruling is having a kind of chilling effect on what happens educationally in terms of are educational organizations and schools going to recognize that students of color are often underserved and are going to make some attempts to correct for that. For example, by making sure that they hire enough diverse teachers so that students have some role models to look up to. And this is very different from, again, I had the privilege of working with an independent school who, for example, was headed by a person who was very liberal and just open to the idea that racism is bad and it is going to affect the quality of education that students get unless there is some kind of action taken by school districts or for people who run schools. So, for example, there was a teacher in this independent school who wanted to proactively work on recruiting people of color to become teachers for that school. And the head of school was very excited about that and really endorsed the program. But I'm afraid that in the K through 12 instances, that the people who run these school districts may take this as a signal, may take the SCOTUS ruling as a signal that they don't have to recognize that there's inequity that's existed and that therefore students, teachers don't need any additional resources or effort to make sure that students of color receive quality education.
I want to jump in on that to say I think it can also mean in my world that because even before the decision, I think there's been a doubling down in the public school system, at least in early childhood, of understanding that the workforce of the future and that preparation for that there are and can be well-paying jobs with a high school diploma and additional training. And there's a doubling down from a standpoint of businesses. I'm a big component that the driver is for me. The driver is that business have around and talk about the future in terms of talent and that coming. And that talent in many parts, including STEM, are jobs that are available with persons with a high school diploma. Brookings did a study, I think it was 2013, and talked about as half of the STEM jobs are available for that population. But it also means a level of investment all the way from talking about ecosystems, all the way from beginning from early childhood. We've got enough data in this country, data data, research, and I love your research, Doctor, but data that tells us that this is possible. It tells us what kind of investments will make a difference intellectually, emotionally for people, for Black and brown people. We know this truthfully. We know the data, but what we're not doing is taking that data and investing to make the difference. It is about our future in terms of the workforce. You've got national organizations now that are moving in that direction, employers that recognize who've actually changed their decisions about jobs that used to require a college degree. And now they're willing to actually develop a training component. There's several that got developed here in the city I'm in terms of making that difference. And the data shows that what that does for the outcome in terms of the income long term. But I also want to add that this whole question of early childhood through 12th grade, that we've also got to make sure to conversation earlier about ecosystems, that we not just look at this in the silo of early childhood to 12th grade in terms of the public school system alone, that understand the ecosystem around how children thrive and move. That really has to be all of that ecosystem that surrounds the school system has to be engaged in this. And we've got to find a way to create those kind of collaboratives and moving that kind of agenda forward. And I know of examples where that's happening. I'm not saying it's happening broadly across the country, but we've got data to prove that this is possible to change those outcomes. So for me, in many ways, that decision means we need to double down in terms of investments and be innovative and be disruptive in those investments in terms of early childhood, 12th grade.
Yeah. You know, I'd like to add on to that. I love that, Diane. And I think K-12 educators will need to redefine what success means after school. So I love college. I'm a huge advocate of getting a college degree. And as to your point, Diane, is that the only measure of success? What about career? I mean, you mentioned like tech, like you can make a lot of money in tech without a 4-year degree. But that also, to expand, that also means that employers then need to really invest in the idea that a 4-year degree may not actually be necessary to be successful. And how do they redesign their job descriptions and what they're seeking to ensure that folks are entering their workplaces? So that means building talent partnerships with high schools to ensure that if you graduate with these skills, maybe another year or so of training, we got a job for you ready to go. That's that's high paying, and you can also build a life with that.
Yeah,
That sense.
I absolutely believe that. But I also want to say that it doesn't take us away from also having to address the issues that are inside of school systems that really, that in terms of structural racism. You talked about it earlier, Dr. Hymon, in terms of, and as well as you, Catherine Brown, the educators, in terms of making sure that we are dismantling, we are educating, we are changing, looking inside of those systems where we, in fact, intentionally, which is those systems were designed to do that, intentionally not benefit Black and Brown students. And so I can say for Baltimore, there's a Dr. Tracy Durant, who's a DEI person for our school system, but she and her colleagues actually wrote a book in terms of around this whole issue of humanity over comfort. But understand they came up with a policy the school board voted on. They used the community advocates, community participants to even come up with what those values and helping define that, bringing that into the school system so it's a board voted policy. So that they begin to then move forward and whatever they do, including the teaching, training with those policies in place. This is such a multi-pronged strategy. And I think of it as strategy in terms you think about early childhood, the 12th grade, how do we begin to move that, including the ecosystem around schools?
I'm also really interested in what happens to Black girls, girls of color in the school system, because we know that there was actually a study done by the Columbia Law School on the variance in discipline and who gets disciplined in K through 12. And the study found that Black girls were about 6 times more likely than white girls to be disciplined. And it was interesting because we always hear about, young Black men, about what happens in schools and et cetera. And yet Black boys were only three times more likely to be disciplined than white boys. And what this means is that they just don't, when you're disciplined, it's almost like a school to prison pipeline, that there's some correlation between who's been given this harsh discipline, who then doesn't get particular opportunities that the school should be providing, who's suddenly a target for the police because of what's happened within the school. So, my concern about these rulings generally is that there's this false narrative that there's no systemic inequity. So let's not really pay attention to, say, the overage of Black girls being disciplined. Well, it just must be because they're acting up and they're not good, et cetera, et cetera. So it is really having, I'm afraid, a chilling effect on paying attention, as we've mentioned, to the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion across all strata of our society. It's really disturbing.
Yeah.
It is very disturbing. And so, we've mentioned from pretty much everybody, somebody's brought in data, right, to support what they're talking about. We're in a paradigm where, big data is a focus, certainly in the tech world. And of course, that has impacts on business, right? But multiple people here today have said, hey, we have strong data that goes against this ruling, right? So if they'd been looking at this data to inform their decisions, this would not be the decision that was made. And yet it was made, right? Further, Dr. Giscombe, you just mentioned false narrative, right? So what do we make of this? Either we're in a data-informed paradigm or we're not. How can we be in this paradigm of where some things are data-informed, but conspicuously when it comes to Black and Brown people, we just don't have data, right? And I mean, it comes off as weak seeming, right? So if we're looking at that whole picture, then one could draw the conclusion that people are ignoring this data because it's simply inconvenient for them, because it's costly, it's time consuming, or what have you. But I'm curious, thoughts on this point?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, unfortunately, politicians have been using this false narrative to ignore facts. I mean, I think just getting out of the school system issues, looking at Ron DeSantis, who's saying that there's benefits to slavery, is just appalling. And unfortunately, people within school systems who may share a political background with someone like a DeSantis, or who may be unwilling to admit that there was systemic inequity, is going to feel free to ignore the effects of systemic inequity and not make any corrections to injustice, including what happens within the school settings.
I think it really is a travesty. I think you're absolutely right, Dr. In terms of people are using it. I think people simply using it for their personal benefit. It's really, it's about power and it's about money. I absolutely believe that in this country. I think I heard former President Obama recently on a show talking about this whole narrative now of different truths. We've been here before in terms of about false truth and false. And so you've created this, is that this is what my belief is. That's what I want to believe. And no amount of data is going to change that belief. And so I think that's a group that we're not going to win over necessarily. But I do think it's important to use data, which is why I love your work, to use data to actually inform and tie that data to the economics in this country. I'm absolutely clear. If this is what drives this country, then tied to how it's going to hurt you as a business economically, how it's going to hurt the GDP in terms of this country. Begin to tie that. And also, I think it changes in terms of around what we do as Black, brown people around our own power and our own education in terms of about that data and being connected.
Karima, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to point out that one of the things that was interesting about this ruling was even the Supreme Court's not being very data minded. And just to say that one of the things that happened in this case, Justice Clarence Thomas was very adamant in saying that his personal individual experience of having received affirmative action, benefited from affirmative action, but having been emotionally scarred because other people sort of judged him as an affirmative action baby was enough to overturn centuries of, or years of sort of moving in this direction and understanding the purpose of affirmative action, right? And so his personal feelings, his personal experience was used as a case of one, as opposed to understanding the data that shows that affirmative action does benefit materially across the board those who are able to gain from it, and it materially benefited him. Whether he acknowledges it or not, he is at one of the highest. He is one of 9, right, in our country, and he was able to get there because of the doors that those policies opened for him. And now he has made the decision to close those policies for others. And so our sort of lack, it's an interesting thing because this isn't what normally SCOTUS does, right? Usually there is going to be more of a sense of what does the data say. But in this case, it was able to say, my personal experience trumps sort of any other data that might be out there. And I think that is really concerning because then it's just, who are those 9 people on the bench and what does their personal experience say about what has happened in the world and what the world could or should be, and that's going to be where we're going. So I just wanted to point out the lack of use of data in the actual court decision.
Yeah, I think I'll just jump in very quickly just to highlight something that you said, Karima. So if we pivot from using a data set that is, information from many, many people, like data scientists, they prefer larger data sets because you can observe patterns across these larger groups of people. But if we pivot from doing that to a sample size of 1, if you've ever been to grad school or you've had to write a thesis or something, then the internal review board of your institution will not allow you to use that data because a data sample of 1 is not valid data. So I'm sorry, did I cut you off, Dr. Hymon?
No, you didn't cut me off, but I love to just jump in. So I think to answer the question, I don't know who said this, but there's a quote that I love, and it's, you can't reason and data someone out of a corner that they did not reason and data themselves into.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't have an answer to this, but I think what's happening is we all have our own ideologies and thoughts and opinions, and we're sticking to them. And I think we somehow need to come together to figure out, why do you think that? Why do you believe that? Where are you getting information from? How were you raised and why? And kind of come together to figure out, what's the new narrative we want to paint together to ensure that we all benefit. And that's very difficult, much easier said than done, but it's concerning, as you all mentioned, that the Supreme Court can make a decision based on personal feelings and anecdotes rather than the data that shows there is some. I'm not trying to avoid saying the word systemic racism, but the people of color have not been able to get in this country somehow, some way. Let's figure out what in the world is happening so we can do something about it. You know,
I think it's also about. I would add that it is also about something we have not done a good job of necessarily in this lane in terms of runners and figuring out how to create coalitions, how to then develop data in a way that can be heard in terms of that, because I do think stories matter, that his story, personal stories matter. I think when I think about somebody like ARP that uses data, but has a huge machinery of being able to use stories and data to convince policymakers to go one direction versus another direction. I think it's about beginning to shift what kind of tools we use in terms of even using data to connect it to the emotions, because you're not going to shift people from an emotional space with just that. You've got to figure out how to use that emotional space to take that data into that space. I'm not saying I know how to do it. I'm just saying that I think that that's a critical next step in coming up with some alliances with other people that may not be Black and brown in terms of that there. So that's why I'm a big proponent for finding allies in terms of shifting that.
That's great. And I think one thing that I just want to emphasize at this point is, Dr. Hymon, when you're talking about, you can't data and reason somebody out of a corner, that's absolutely true. The way that I learned it was a little bit different, which is you can't persuade somebody into doing something that they're not already open to. Right. And in fact, there is a psychological phenomena called reactance. Right. So if you tell somebody to do something, and we've all observed this, you may have even observed it in yourself.
Yeah.
For example, think back to the last time your mother told you to do something. Was your first urge, yes, mother, I'm going to do that? Or like, I'm a grown up. You don't have to tell me what to do. Right. Was it something like that? If it was, that was reactance. Right. And so you can imagine if that's happening in a population of, I don't know, 330 plus million people, that might be a lot of reactance happening, right? So I'd like to pivot now to our next question, right? As we've kind of alluded to and discussed, there are deep inequities in, of course, higher education, but of course, those inequities in fact begin long before students even think of going to those institutions. So another recent SCOTUS ruling was against student loan forgiveness. And so my question to all of you is, what impacts can we expect to see on early childhood through 12th grade education, either in addition to or exacerbating, the existing inequities? And, if people are maybe unfamiliar with some of the inequities in early childhood through 12th grade education, perhaps we can also kind of pull the thread on that as well. Who would like to start?
I can jump in here.
Great.
So I think also there was another recent study that came out since SCOTUS's decision that was just talking about who affirmative action actually benefits at the most elite college, or also I think it was mostly, not affirmative action, legacy, and it's right. And one of the things that was pointed out was how much of a leg up both private school and sort of elite schoolings in K through 12 provide for people as they're going to apply for college. And a big part of that might be that you get to have a higher test score, say SAT or ACT score, because you have more access to various preparation materials, et cetera, et cetera. But there was also something that people are calling essentially private school polish, which is that private schools function wholly, or a big part of their function is simply to get their students into elite universities, right? Public and private. And so the inequities start in early childhood, right? The inequities start from the point at which some students live in communities that don't have access to resources, and there's intensity around sort of the entire community is also under-resourced, And so then what happens is those schools have a higher concentration of students with particular needs coming to the school, and then they're less likely to be able to meet those needs, right? When I was a principal, if you use the measure that the state uses, which is who qualifies for free and reduced lunch, we had over 95% of our students qualifying. And so what that often comes with is students who have trauma, students who are behind, students for whom the school functions not just as a place for learning, but a social safety net. One of the things I did every year as a principal was take our fifth graders to a program to check to see if they needed glasses. I
Mm.
don't think that's the case for the average private school principal, that they're making sure that their fifth graders have glasses. And that continues into high school with access to advanced placement courses, access to various types of, whether it's advanced placement or career and technical education courses that can put them on a path to show an admissions counselor, hey, I'm ready to be a part of your school, and this is what I would bring. And so there's not yet or that comes the disadvantage, right? And therefore often the need for affirmative action policies. But just wanted to point out that the inequities start very young and they continue, and they can multiply, right?
Mhm.
So those who have advantages, the advantages multiply, and those without, it becomes more and more of a barrier as they head off to applying for college.
Thank you for that. I think I'll just jump in very quickly to give a concrete example. So, um, people who are not from New England may not be aware of this, but within New England, where I'm originally from, it's very well known that the private schools, Phillips Exeter and Phillips Andover, were actually established to be feeder schools, respectively, for
Right.
Harvard and Yale. Right. So the Bushes, they all went to Phillips Andover because traditionally they go to Yale, right? And they have for hundreds of years, right? So these are well established people that are in these circles, they know these things. But I think another thing that you were saying, Karima, is that one of the impacts of lessening the prevalence of diversity is that we end up with hyper concentrations both at the quote unquote high end and at the quote unquote low end, right? And so if a lot of things, like as in economics, depends on things flowing, then you do not want hyper concentrations of things, right? You want flows so that things can move around.
But
Uh,
also looking at the inequity that exists among different types of schools,
yeah.
the fact that in the United States versus other countries, public schools are basically funded based on the property taxes.
Yes.
So
Hmm.
those in wealthy areas simply have, and these areas tend to be more white, it's because of segregation and just the segregation that continues in spite of efforts to dismantle it. So basically children and teens in, say, mostly people of color areas, I mean, there tends to be obviously less value of homes, less property tax. And I remember talking with a friend from Canada about this, and she was just appalled that the
Mm.
United States did this. That, well, we don't do that in Canada, but that system is pretty well entrenched. So I don't think that there's a way to immediately dismantle it, but at least we need to be aware of it and try to make these efforts to give these children educational experiences that they may not at the outset get in their poorly funded public schools.
Well, I want to jump in there because I want to jump in and give a shout out to Maryland, who, in terms of, we just went through this enormous set years in terms of commission investigating in terms of what was needed to change the quality of education in the entire state, in terms of the millions of dollars that got approved. It was probably more than that in terms of actually each school district submitting their plan, but it includes early childhood that develop. It goes include putting tutors in the classroom. It includes very concretely recognizing that resources, to a very point, if property tax are all we got to that, that's not enough in areas where you don't have the property tax. And I don't want to go off on tangent. Somewhere I read somewhere in Mississippi where the property tax is not even available because much of that, it was New Haven, much of that land is owned by Yale. And so that land is taken off of the property tax roll. So what does that mean for those schools? But going back to Maryland, I want to give another concrete example around early childhood through 12th grade of where you can actually do demonstrations. I think philanthropy has a role in the past of developing demonstration models and being able to take that demonstration model where you actually can be change some of those system issues by what the data you've gotten out of a particular program, and actually then begin to shift that entire school system, that entire school district. I think we've got to rely upon that other sector that's now having a different kind of conscience for moving that forward. And in some states across, in some cities where you do have philanthropy playing that role, so it can demonstrate that if you've got these resources, this system, this structure, you can do it. It was called grads to career, and it was a multi collaborative that put that in place, and they knew that kids were coming out of school looking at the data. X percentage were going to college, X percent were going to work. And there's this group that were just dropped off. They weren't counted in the workforce. They weren't going to college. And they literally spent 2 years digging down and looking at the research, digging down and looking at what was going on in the school system, develop a collaborative of the workforce investment, of community, of the school system, and actually putting in place and wraparound services and support system and training for those young people coming out to move them into a job, well-paying job, and move them into college, some percentage that. But what that happened out of that model, it actually then the school system began to change in terms of, which has an equity framework, began to change how they, who only had an office focused on college advancement, then began to have an office that wrapped up focus on career and understanding who that student was that was not yet focused, and how to begin starting earlier to help move that focus moving forward. And so the system actually shifted inside of that. The system shifted inside of the Office of Employment Development. But that was funded by philanthropy initially for 4 years to prove that we can do something different. And the goal of that is called Baltimore's Promise, is to change these systems and get funding from government to actually then shift how they approach the school system and early childhood.
So Diane, I want to follow up on that, and thank you so much for bringing all that into the conversation. Right, so we know that systems are big, but they're established by people, right? They didn't appear whole cloth out of nowhere in our lives. But in your view, why is it that so many people have a hard time grappling with the concept of systemic change? You know, so they hear systemic change, and then there's people that almost become disempowered. They're like, oh, there's nothing we can do about it, right? It's like, but we did it. That's why it exists.
I think it is because it feels so big. It feels so overwhelming, which is why I applaud the effort. And there are lots of efforts across this country where people have taken that and actually develop a pilot, or actually develop to move forward, or they've taken a leader, and that particular leader, very point is that, but taking a leader that had an affinity in terms of wanting to do something different, had an affinity to grow their own knowledge. I'll give you another concrete example. You do have to shift. You do have to educate that. The leadership for our local utility company, BG&E, in terms of dynamic leader became in terms of it, actually changed the entire organization, both in terms of how it operated, having a DEI focus, but critically, they were only focused on believing that they could get people ready to come into the workforce by investing in K through early childhood through 12th grade. They were not willing to necessarily look at those workers or persons out there that only had a high school diploma and how to move them. They literally have changed the entire operation. They've actually now shifted and have had ability to bring in people, training, developing them, and then bring them and coaching them, and have a phenomenal change in terms of positive. They know they're going to age out. So that was an economic issue, but it was a value issue, because they knew if they didn't shift what it was going to mean to the company. I think you have to do both. You have to start with people and help move them. That's why I think DEI is so important, because until they're willing, if you've got DEI down here, you're not going to make any of those systemic changes.
Thank you. Oh, Karima?
Yeah, I just want to add in here to Diane's point that one of the things then that's really important for DI practitioners to do is to help people build a systemic lens. Because I think another thing that happens is that the systems that impact our lives are just hidden on and on, right? I will quote a statistic that I'm not sure where I got it from, but even in the media, when we hear about cases of, say, systemic racism or other systems, we often hear one person's story.
Sorry.
No worries.
We often hear about one person's story as opposed to understanding the systems that are involved. So, say in education, something that is coming up is, or maybe I've heard the story of a student athlete who wasn't allowed to compete because of their hair, right? And so I hear about that one student, the impact to them, and I see it as a personal story and what how negatively that impact, but I'm not seeing that, well, what are the systems involved? Whatever state federation, the school systems, the policies around that. And so that one of our jobs as whatever practitioners of DEI is to make sure that we help people understand that systems can work for us or they can work to create the world as it is, or they can work to create a fairer, more just, more free world if we help to, one, see them, and then to say, what do we want this system to create for us, right? So the other thing is, I think there's a lot of mythology around the individual in our country, and so that reinforces that it's not about the systems, right? Justice Thomas spoke to that, right? It's not that each Black person has the same experience, right? But it's about what you individually can do and can bring to your school, as opposed to what, Justice, I'm going to forget her name, but she said is that we have
Ketanji Brown?
And Brown.
Brown, she said that what we have to do is make sure that we understand the way systems continue to impact our lives. And so it's not that we're not individually responsible for our actions, but systems have been brought to bear on communities. And so how do we systemically then make policy that can help those communities that are experiencing that? So I think important thing that we need to do is make sure that we're always incorporating that systemic lens into our work so that people develop that as a muscle that they can use going forward.
I think I want to jump in on that, though, Karina. Do you think it helps to also begin to show the picture? I think to the point is that people think of individually, that showing your earlier statement about the ecosystem, actually beginning to describe it, to really show it on paper in terms of connecting. What we know about systems is when you punch it here, it moves there. But actually beginning to help people, I think you're 1,001 correct about, as DI professionals, we do have to have that conversation and help people do it. And I think we've got to continue to find tools to help people understand it. It's not a straight conversation. It's not an easy thing to understand, but I think we do have to spend the time to lay out graphically, to then show it in their own lives. In terms of when you can show people those systems in their own lives, it changes their sense of what you're talking about.
It would also be great if we took some of those arguments to those politicians who think that there's no such thing as systemic inequity, that it's such I think a very poor argument that they make. And if they're facts that they can be confronted with in terms of what's happened in this country because of Jim Crow, overt discrimination against African Americans and other people of color, hopefully that might shift some viewpoints. So unfortunately, they seem to be pretty stuck in this, there's no such thing as systemic inequities. It's almost like a willed ignorance on their part. I hate to sound so harsh about this, but I think it's going to take a lot of effort to move those, to move that mindset.
Yeah, you can only fit so many elephants in a room, and especially true if it's a very small room. Dr. Hymon, I think you wanted to get in there.
I've heard a lot of politicians express, yes, we acknowledge racism. Yes, we acknowledge slavery in the past. Yes, that happened. But today, let's just move forward, right? That everyone has the opportunity. And I think it's hard for folks to recognize that something happened for centuries and then also espouse that it actually does not have an impact today. So that's very frustrating. And, Karina and Diane, I think you both talked about school funding. And what came to mind as you were talking about that is, one other inequity I'd love to bring in is the access to extracurricular activities. And a lot of college admissions look for what they call well-rounded students who are in
Yeah.
sports and activities and
Mhm.
things like that. And if a school doesn't have funding, one of the first things they slice is the music classrooms or the sports teams or things like that. So that's just another building inequity where I have the grades, I have the scores. Maybe I didn't have the sports or the access to other activities, and I'm not showing as well-rounded in the college admissions process. And that's, I think, an inequity, right? It's frustrating for some students. And Karina, you talked about a study earlier, and I actually just came across that study this morning that showed that the most advantaged people are those that are the ultra rich, right? They have all of those advantages, and they get most admissions into colleges. And then what's interesting is the second most advantaged is qualified. Affirmative action is not bringing in unqualified folks, right? But qualified people who are then low income, right? So for those really, really solid middle class students who are saying, "Oh, those black and brown folks are taking our spots," I mean, I don't want to put us against each other, but that's actually not happening. The folks that are taking the spots are the most advantaged and the most rich in our country. So I think if all of us in the middle and lower class work together to bring down systems that advantage the most elite, we actually will all benefit, you know? So that's what's on my mind.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. I do want to pivot to our last question area, just so we're not missing out on this other SCOTUS ruling that was made, right? So the other ruling that I have in mind is the ruling on religion, free speech, and LGBTQIA plus rights, right? So essentially, it said that a web designer has a First Amendment right to refuse to create sites for same-sex weddings, despite a state law prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation. And of course, since this ruling, people have dug into this a little bit, and I guess I'm still not 100% clear, but there are people who are saying this was based on a lie, on a falsehood. But in either case, right, I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that families don't necessarily look the way that many of us grew up expecting families to look, right? So there are many families out there with parents of the same sex, or, it might be a different living situation. But nonetheless, I think we can expect this particular ruling to have some impact on people entering higher education and the workforce in the future. So I'm curious if any of you all have thoughts around this particular ruling.
I'm not sure that I have a thought about that ruling, but I do think that one of the things that the combination of the different Supreme Court rulings are sort of signaling to the world, and I think my sense that educators are feeling very maybe unmoored, or where's the grounding and where's this going to stop, right? What the Supreme Court is signaling is we're open for business, so to speak, around um, undoing what was considered the law of the land, right? Or reinterpreting things that now have 50 or 60 years of saying this is what this means and this is how we understand. Whether in this case it's um, to this latest one, what you're saying, the limits of free speech, right? And when does free speech come up against somebody's individual rights, right? And so what then happens for, in particular, EC through 12 educators, it's like, is now part of my job to also be a Supreme Court expert so that I don't run amok of the law in my particular classroom, right? And we're
Mm,
seeing that especially with the book bannings, which that hasn't yet, been brought up to the Supreme Court, but sort of whose version of history are we teaching? Well, there's not multiple versions of history as we alluded to, but what is being taught in our schools, and to what extent, who gets to decide that, I think is another big question that I don't know if or when or how it then might be ruled on by the Supreme Court. But to me, what the sort of combination of rulings are saying is we're open for shifting things that we've seen as the law of the land for the last 50 years. And who knows sort of where it's going to stop and when it's going to stop. And I think the impact of that on educators, educational administrators, is to sort of feel like they have another job on their already full plates of needing to know this whole other context and set of things to do the work that they're doing, which is just really unfair and unnecessary because
Hmm.
they're already busy enough and they're doing some of the most important work
Mhm.
that anyone can be doing, right?
Right. So to recap a little bit, we've got one segment of the population saying that systemic inequity does not exist, or perhaps it is not so harmful. And it's the same broad group of people who are saying, now let's go change the system. Right. So it's it's beyond frustrating, I think. Other thoughts here?
Yeah, I don't have a concrete thought, but there are two connections that I'm making in my head, or two questions that I'm asking myself. One is, how does this impact the workplace? If there's an employer who wants to discriminate against LGBTQ plus, can they not hire that person? Can they fire that person? Like, where does this go? Because as a business owner, if I cannot serve that population, is that only my service? Is that my hiring, my employment? So I'm just trying to figure out where that goes, and that's really scary. I think the second connection I'm making is the Supreme Court said that, at least in this case, free speech is more important than the LGBTQ plus person's ability to access full citizenship in the world. And I'm a religious person, but a couple decades ago, the Mormon Church wasn't clear about Black people. So, like, can a church now not serve different groups of people? So it makes me fear for LGBTQ plus people, also fear for me as a Black person. Is it next for me in a certain institution? Just not sure where it's going.
Right. So now that precedent has been set, what are people going to do with it is kind of the question.
I want to add, though, on that point, and this is not concrete, so I'm pushing back a little bit. It's not a concrete statement, but I do think I look at that lens, both that decision, all the decisions by the Supreme Court, as an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity in the sense of coalition, an opportunity in terms of various those groups, in terms of figuring out how do we begin to push together, how do we begin to find the common agenda. I have very pet peeve about figuring out how to shift even us as citizens and understanding what our, not just our rights, but our responsibilities are in democracy in terms of pushing back. I don't think we're seeing the pushback on this side of the world in terms of understanding that we can do something, we can hold people accountable, that elected official, in terms of having community stat so that you know how they voted. Does that benefit you or not versus what they say when they go into office? I absolutely think we are missing an opportunity to actually take those decisions and develop a different kind of coalition to move this agenda forward, to move this country forward, and push back against what's happening.
And actually, just given my work at Catalyst in terms of just women in the workplace and minorities in the workplace, there's such a important role that could be played by these CEOs, because in the past they have very strongly supported diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that there is some fear that this ruling is going to affect what so-called affirmative action within companies can do. But there are, very powerful, very wealthy CEOs who have very strongly supported diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm kind of waiting for them to jump into this and to just give us a little bit more context on how important it is.
So, Dr. Giscombe, we're almost at time here, and I wonder if you've got any kind of final thoughts for folks or things that they can maybe take out of the box today and start doing to maybe start moving the ball more in the direction that we're saying is necessary moving forward.
I think just the awareness that there is systemic inequity that exists. I mean, whether it's through education, whether it's through speaking engagements, whether it's through op-eds, but just kind of drilling down and trying to educate as many as we can in this country that systemic inequity is very powerful and we can't just ignore it.
Thank you. Diane, I'll pivot to you.
I think my thing, because we are talking about a DEI audience here as well, I think we also, as a part of this space, can begin to figure out how we can come together in terms of benefit from each other's expertise, in terms of different areas, in terms of moving this agenda forward, in terms of particularly pushing back.
Thank you. And Dr. Hymon?
Yes, not to give up the fight on systemic issues, but two practical recommendations. If you are a quick K-12 educator, let's redefine post-secondary success and help students see that there's a variety of different ways to be successful. And if you're an employer, remove the degree requirement. Let's actually look at skills as the primary determinants of success rather than a degree.
I would agree with that.
And I think I'll leave the last word to you, Karima.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that, the four of us come from and share a background as Black Americans. And a big part of this work is also building coalition across lines of difference, right? And so are the four presenters. And so it's important that we're understanding who's in the room always and who's not in the room. And how do we make sure to hear from who's not in the room? That's one way to start. Just, are we coalition building, to Diane's point, as many ways as we can be, but also stay hopeful, find ways to be hopeful about how we can make change.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think it's worth remembering too that this is a reaction to some of the progress that has been made in the past several years. So if there's people out there feeling discouraged or hopeless, I completely understand, but now is not the time to lose hope or to lose energy. In fact, now is the time to step it up, to figure out who we can connect with, as Diane and others have been saying. And of course, if you're not sure where to turn for community, well, then of course you can check out DiVerity.com. In fact, that's how I met all of these lovely people right here. It's a great community, a lot of very intelligent, incredibly well-intentioned people, and I think there's great potential for change there. So once again, don't lose hope. This is Enrico Hymon for the DEI is podcast. Sorry for flubbing my lines earlier, everybody. I apologize, but we'll have the chance to do it all again next time, so can't wait to see you all then. Till then, I hope you'll all be well. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.